The morning Eliza Bennett watched her father's casket being lowered into the hard Kansas earth, she learned exactly what she was worth to the men of Newton. $300 and a worn-out homestead that barely produced enough wheat to feed the mice in the barn. 22 years old and suddenly alone, she stood at the graveside with her hands folded over her black dress, listening to Reverend Collins drone on about dust and ashes, while Marcus Hennigan stood behind her like a vulture waiting for something to die. Marcus owned half the businesses in Newton and most of the debts that kept the other half running, including the note her father had signed 2 years back when the drought nearly killed everything. Now that note was hers, and Marcus had made it clear over coffee at the wake that he intended to collect one way or another. "Your father was a good man, Eliza, but he was not a practical man," Marcus had said, his thick fingers wrapped around the delicate china cup her mother had brought from Pennsylvania before the fever took her. "A woman cannot run a homestead alone. It would be the Christian thing, the sensible thing, for you to accept my offer of marriage. Your debts would be forgiven, and you would want for nothing." Eliza had looked at Marcus Hennigan with his oiled hair and his soft hands and his eyes that traveled over her like she was livestock at auction, and she had said the only thing her pride would allow. "I will consider your generous offer, Mr. Hennigan, and give you my answer in 1 week's time." That had been 3 days ago, and Eliza had spent those 72 hours doing everything she could think of to avoid becoming Mrs. Marcus Hennigan. She had ridden into town to speak with the banker, who had been sympathetic but firm. The note was due in full by the end of September, just 6 weeks away, and without her father's labor, there was no possibility of bringing in enough harvest to cover it. She had visited the solicitor, who had explained in patient tones that, as an unmarried woman, her options for securing credit or employment were severely limited. She had even swallowed her pride and approached the women's auxiliary at the church, hoping that Christian charity might extend to a loan or at least advice. But they had simply clucked their tongues and suggested that Marcus Hennigan was a respectable widower and that she could do far worse. By the 4th morning, Eliza woke before dawn with a plan that was either brilliant or desperately foolish. She dressed in her riding clothes, saddled her father's old mare, and headed east toward the cattle trails where the herds were being driven up from Texas to the railhead. If she could not save her home as a woman, perhaps she could save it by doing what her father should have done years ago, hiring on experienced help for the harvest and hoping to bring in enough wheat to at least negotiate terms with the bank. Drovers and cowboys passed through Newton by the hundreds during the season, men looking for work between drives, men with strong backs and few questions. All she needed was 1 or 2 willing to work for a share of the harvest instead of wages up front, and she might buy herself enough time to find a real solution. The sun was just beginning to paint the sky pink when she reached the encampment at the edge of town, where the trail hands gathered between drives. Canvas tents and bedrolls dotted the grassland, and the smell of coffee and frying bacon drifted on the morning breeze. Men were stirring, tending to horses and gear, their voices low and rough with sleep. Eliza dismounted and tied her mare to a scrub oak, suddenly aware of how foolish she must look, a woman alone in a camp full of strange men. But desperation had burned away most of her natural caution, and she walked into the camp with her chin up and her shoulders back, looking for someone who might at least hear her out before laughing her away. "Help you, miss?" A young man with a sunburned face and kind eyes approached, wiping his hands on his pants. He could not have been more than 19, still soft around the edges in a way that told Eliza he had not been on the trail very long. "I am looking to hire men for harvest work," Eliza said, pitching her voice to carry confidence she did not quite feel. "My homestead is 2 miles west of here, 40 acres of wheat coming ripe, and I need experienced hands who can work hard and fast." The young man's face fell into apologetic lines. "Most of the boys here are signed on for the next drive north, madam. We are heading out tomorrow at first light. But you might ask Dalton Cole over there. He just came in from a drive and has not signed on for another yet." He pointed toward a lean-to shelter where a tall man was saddling a rangy bay horse, his back to them, his movements efficient and economical. Eliza thanked him and made her way across the camp, her boots crunching on the dry grass. As she got closer, she could see that Dalton Cole was older than most of the hands, probably close to her own age or a few years more, with dark hair that curled over his collar and shoulders that spoke of years of hard work. His clothes were worn but clean, his hat battered but serviceable, and when he turned at the sound of her approach, she found herself looking into eyes the color of weathered wood, set in a face that was more interesting than handsome, all sharp angles and sun-darkened skin. "Mr. Cole." She stopped a respectful distance away, folding her hands to keep them from shaking. "My name is Eliza Bennett. I own a homestead west of Newton, and I am looking for a man willing to work a harvest for a share of the profits. I understand you are between drives and might be interested in the work." Dalton Cole looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to his horse and continued cinching the saddle. "Not interested in farm work, miss. I am a drover, not a field hand." "The pay would be fair," Eliza pressed on, taking a step closer. "I can offer 20% of whatever the harvest brings, plus meals and a place to sleep in the barn. The wheat is good this year, and with an experienced man helping with the cutting and threshing, we could bring in enough to make it worth your while. 20% of a small homestead harvest would not buy me a new pair of boots." Dalton swung up into the saddle with an ease that spoke of a lifetime on horseback. "I am heading to Dodge City. There is work there that pays in actual money, not promises and percentages." "Good luck to you, Miss Bennett." He turned the bay toward the road, and Eliza felt her last hope starting to slip away like water through her fingers. Without thinking, she grabbed the horse's bridle, forcing Dalton to either stop or run her down. "Please," she said, and the word came out raw and desperate in a way that shamed her. "I have no one else to ask. My father died last week, and there is a note on the property that comes due in 6 weeks. If I cannot bring in this harvest, I will lose everything. I will be forced to marry a man I do not love just to keep a roof over my head. Please, I am begging you." Something shifted in Dalton's expression, a crack in the careful indifference. He looked down at her hand on the bridle, then at her face, and she saw the exact moment he made his decision. His jaw tightened, and he let out a long breath through his nose. "Let go of my horse, miss." Eliza released the bridle, her cheeks burning with humiliation. She had actually begged, had laid out her desperation for a stranger to judge, and he was still riding away. She turned to walk back to her mare, blinking hard against the tears that threatened to fall. "Miss Bennett." She stopped, not trusting herself to turn around. "I will give you 3 days," Dalton said from behind her. "I will come look at your land, assess what needs doing, and if I think there is any chance of bringing in a harvest that will actually help your situation, I will stay for the full 6 weeks. But if I think you are fighting a losing battle, I am leaving for Dodge, and you will not try to stop me. Do we have an agreement?" Eliza turned slowly, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Dalton had dismounted and was standing with his horse's reins in one hand, watching her with an expression that was equal parts resignation and something that might have been sympathy. "Yes," she said, her voice steadier now. "Yes, we have an agreement. "Thank you, Mr. Cole. You will not regret this." "I already regret it," he said, but there was no real heat in the words. "Lead the way, Miss Bennett. Let us see what kind of mess I have just agreed to." They rode west in the growing light, Eliza on her father's old mare and Dalton on his bay, keeping a respectful distance between their horses. Eliza used the time to study her unexpected helper, trying to gauge what kind of man she had just invited onto her property. He sat his horse like he had been born in the saddle, moving with the animal's rhythm in that unconscious way that marked a true horseman. His hands on the reins were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who worked for a living, and there was a rifle in a scabbard on his saddle, well maintained but clearly used. Everything about him spoke of competence and self-sufficiency, and Eliza found herself feeling the first small flutter of hope that maybe, just maybe, this could actually work. "You said your father died last week," Dalton said, after they had been riding for about 20 minutes. "What did he die of, if you do not mind my asking?" "His heart gave out," Eliza said, the words still strange in her mouth. "He had been working from dawn to dusk trying to get the fields ready for harvest, and one morning he simply did not wake up. The doctor said it was quick, that he likely did not suffer. I suppose that is meant to be a comfort." "Is it?" Eliza considered the question. "No," she admitted. "It just feels sudden and wrong, like a sentence that ends in the middle with no warning. He was only 53 years old. He should have had more time." "My father died when I was 16, Dalton offered, his eyes on the horizon. "Thrown from a horse and broke his neck. One minute he was laughing about something, the next he was on the ground and gone. Took me a long time to make peace with the suddenness of it." "Have you made peace with it now?" He was quiet for a moment. "Mostly. I figure some things are not meant to be understood, just accepted. Does not mean it does not hurt, but the hurt gets easier to carry after a while." They crested a low rise, and Eliza's homestead came into view. 40 acres of wheat rippling golden in the morning breeze, the small house with its sagging porch, the barn that leaned slightly to the left, the windmill creaking as it turned. It was not much, but it was hers, the only piece of her parents that remained, and looking at it now through a stranger's eyes, Eliza felt a fierce rush of love for the shabby little farm that had been her whole world. Dalton reined in his horse and sat for a long moment, surveying the land with the practiced eye of someone who knew what he was looking at. Eliza held her breath, waiting for his judgment, terrified that he would pronounce the situation hopeless and leave her to face Marcus Hennigan and his soft hands and his predatory smile. "The wheat looks good," Dalton said finally. "Better than I expected. Your father clearly knew what he was doing with the planting. But 40 acres is a lot of work for 2 people, especially with harvest coming on fast. We will need a crew for the threshing, and that will cost money you probably do not have." "I have a little saved," Eliza said. "Not much, but enough to pay a threshing crew for a day or two if we can get the wheat cut and bundled first. And there are women in town who might be willing to help with the cooking and feeding if I can offer them something in trade." Dalton nodded slowly. "Show me your equipment." "I need to see what we have to work with." They spent the next hour going through the barn and the outbuildings, taking inventory of what existed and what would be needed. Her father had a decent wheat cradle for cutting, a serviceable scythe, and enough rope and canvas to make bundles, but the threshing machine was ancient and temperamental, held together with baling wire and optimism. Dalton inspected it with the air of a surgeon examining a difficult patient, testing moving parts and making small adjustments while Eliza watched anxiously. "I can keep this thing running," he said at last, wiping oil from his hands with a rag. "But it will be slow going, and if something breaks mid-harvest, we are in trouble. We will need to have spare parts on hand, which means another trip to town and more money spent. I will find the money, Eliza said, though she had no idea where she would find it. What else? Your barn needs work. That lean is only going to get worse, and if we get a strong wind during harvest, the whole thing could come down on top of us and the equipment. I can shore it up, but that will take time we do not really have. Then we work nights, Eliza said. I can hold a lantern while you work, and we sleep in shifts during the day. Dalton gave her a measuring look, and something like respect flickered in his eyes. You are not afraid of hard work, I will give you that. All right, Miss Bennett, I will stay. 3 days turned into 6 weeks, and God help us both if this turns into the disaster I suspect it will be. They shook hands on it, Eliza's small hand disappearing into Dalton's work-roughened palm. And in that moment, standing in the dusty barn with sunlight slanting through the gaps in the walls, Eliza felt something shift in her chest. It was not hope exactly, not yet, but it was the possibility of hope, and that was more than she had felt in days. The first week was brutal. Dalton proved to be exactly what he had claimed. A drover, not a farmer, which meant he was strong and tireless and capable, but he had to learn the specific rhythms of harvest work on the fly. Eliza found herself teaching him techniques her father had shown her years ago. How to judge when the wheat was ready for cutting, how to bundle it properly so it would dry without molding, how to stack the bundles so the rain would run off instead of soaking through. To his credit, Dalton was a quick study and took direction without ego, something Eliza had not expected from a cowboy who clearly prided himself on his competence. They worked from dawn until well after dark, cutting wheat under the fierce Kansas sun until Eliza's back screamed and her hands bled through the gloves she wore. Dalton worked beside her without complaint, his shirt soaked through with sweat, his face burned red despite the hat he wore. At night, they would stumble back to the house, too exhausted to do more than eat whatever cold meal Eliza had prepared earlier and fall into their separate sleeping places. Eliza in her father's bedroom, Dalton in a bedroll in the barn. On the 8th day, Eliza woke to the sound of hammering and found Dalton already up on the barn roof, replacing rotted shingles in the thin light before dawn. She made coffee and brought it out to him, climbing the ladder with the cup balanced carefully in one hand. You should have woken me, she called up. I could have helped. You need sleep more than I do, Dalton said, taking the coffee gratefully. Besides, roof work is not something I need teaching. I did enough of it growing up to know my way around a hammer and nails. Eliza settled on the edge of the roof beside him, letting her legs dangle over the edge. The sun was just starting to break over the horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and orange, and for a moment, they sat in companionable silence, drinking coffee and watching the day begin. Can I ask you something? Eliza said after a while. You can ask. Cannot promise I will answer. Why did you agree to stay? You could be in Dodge City by now, earning real wages instead of gambling on a percentage of a harvest that might not even come in. What made you change your mind? Dalton was quiet for so long that Eliza thought he was not going to answer. Then he took a long drink of coffee and set the cup down on the roof between them. My sister, he said finally. Her name was Caroline, and she was 2 years younger than me. After our father died, our mother remarried a man who seemed decent enough at first, but he turned mean once the ink was dry on the marriage certificate. Caroline was 16, pretty, and our stepfather looked at her the way no man should look at a child. She came to me and begged me to take her away, and I told her to give me 6 months to save enough money for us both to leave. I thought I had time. I thought I could protect her by staying close and making sure he never got her alone. He stopped, his jaw working, and Eliza felt her stomach drop. What happened? She ran away before the 6 months were up. Took a horse in the middle of the night and just disappeared. We found her 3 days later in a creek bed, drowned. The sheriff said it was an accident, that she must have been crossing when the horse spooked and threw her. But Caroline was the best rider in the county. She would not have been thrown by a spooking horse. His voice was flat, empty of emotion in a way that was somehow more painful than tears. I have spent the last 7 years wondering if I could have saved her if I had just listened when she asked, if I had not told her to wait. Dalton, I am so sorry. Eliza reached out and laid her hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. But that was not your fault. You were trying to do the right thing. Intentions do not matter much when someone ends up dead, Dalton said. But when you grabbed my horse and begged me to help, you sounded like Caroline did that last time I saw her. Like you were drowning and looking for someone to pull you out. I could not walk away from that again. I could not spend another 7 years wondering if I could have made a difference. They sat together on the roof as the sun climbed higher, and Eliza felt something fundamental shift between them. They were no longer just employer and employee, not anymore. They were two people who had both lost too much, and were trying desperately not to lose anything more. The work continued, relentless and exhausting. Eliza made a trip to town for supplies and to spread the word that she would need a threshing crew in 4 weeks' time. The trip was complicated by Marcus Hennigan, who cornered her outside the general store and asked in his oily voice whether she had made a decision about his proposal. I have decided to bring in my harvest first, Eliza said, keeping her voice level and polite. Once I know where I stand financially, I will be better able to give you an answer, Mr. Hennigan. Marcus's face darkened. I am not a patient man, Eliza. I have been more than generous in extending you time to consider, but my generosity has limits. You have until the end of the month to give me your answer, or I will be forced to consider our understanding at an end. Then I will give you my answer at the end of the month, Eliza said, and brushed past him into the store before he could say anything else. She returned to the homestead with her supplies and found Dalton finishing up the last section of field that needed cutting. He had taken his shirt off in the heat, working in just his undershirt, and Eliza found herself noticing for the first time the lean strength of his arms, the way his muscles moved under sun-darkened skin. She looked away quickly, embarrassed by the direction of her thoughts, and busied herself unloading the supplies from the wagon. That night, they ate dinner on the porch, too tired to bother with the dining table inside. Eliza had made stew from salt pork and vegetables from her kitchen garden, and they ate in silence, listening to the crickets and the distant sound of cattle lowing somewhere on the prairie. I saw Marcus Hennigan in town today, Eliza said after she had scraped the last of the stew from her bowl. He reminded me that I have until the end of the month to give him an answer about his marriage proposal. Dalton went very still. Marriage proposal. He holds the note on this property. When my father died, Marcus made it clear that the debt could be forgiven if I agreed to become his wife. Eliza stared out at the darkening fields, unable to look at Dalton while she said the words. He is not a cruel man exactly, but he is not a kind one either. He wants a wife the way he wants a new horse or a profitable business, as something to own and display. I would rather lose the farm than spend my life being owned by Marcus Hennigan. Then you will not marry him, Dalton said, and there was something fierce in his voice that made Eliza turn to look at him. We will bring in this harvest, pay off your debt, and you will tell Marcus Hennigan to go straight to hell. That is the plan, and we are going to make it work. Eliza felt tears prick at the back of her eyes. What if it is not enough? What if we bring in the harvest and it still does not cover the debt? Then we will figure out another plan. But you are not marrying a man you do not love just to keep a piece of land. There has to be another way. Why do you care? The question came out more raw than Eliza had intended. You barely know me. Why does it matter to you what I do? Dalton looked at her for a long moment, and in the fading light his eyes were dark and unreadable. Because I have seen what happens when women are backed into corners with no way out, he said quietly. And I will be damned if I stand by and let it happen again when I have the power to do something about it. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of work and worry. The wheat was all cut and bundled, drying in neat rows across the field, and Dalton had managed to get the threshing machine working at something close to peak efficiency. They had hired a crew of 6 men from town to help with the threshing, paying them wages that made Eliza's stomach churn with anxiety. But Dalton assured her it was necessary if they wanted to finish before the weather turned. Eliza found herself watching Dalton more and more as the days went by, noticing small things. The way he always made sure she ate before he did, the way he would wordlessly take over the heaviest tasks without making her feel weak or incapable, the way he sometimes caught her eye across the field and smiled, a quick flash of warmth that made her heart do strange things in her chest. She told herself it was gratitude she felt, simple appreciation for a man who was working himself to exhaustion to help her save her home. But late at night, lying in bed and listening to the sound of Dalton moving around in the barn, she knew it was more than that. She was falling for him, for his quiet competence and his dry humor, and the way he looked at her like she was someone worth saving. The threshing was completed with 3 days to spare before the end of September. Eliza sold the wheat to the grain merchant in Newton, negotiating a fair price that left her with enough money to pay off the note and have a little left over for winter supplies. She went to the bank the same day and paid the debt in full, watching as the banker marked the note as satisfied and handed her the deed to the property, free and clear. Walking out of the bank with that piece of paper in her hands, Eliza felt like she could breathe for the first time in weeks. She had done it. Against all odds, with the help of a cowboy who had stopped when he could have ridden on, she had saved her home. She returned to the homestead to find Dalton packing his gear in the barn. His bedroll was tied, his saddlebags packed, and his bay horse was saddled and ready to go. Eliza stopped in the doorway, the deed still clutched in her hand, and felt her heart crack right down the middle. "You are leaving," she said, and it was not a question. "Our agreement was 6 weeks," Dalton said without looking at her. "The harvest is in, the debt is paid, and my work here is done. It is time for me to move on, to Dodge City, probably, or maybe further west. There is always work for a man who knows horses and cattle." Eliza walked into the barn, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. "What do I owe you?" "Your share of the harvest. Keep it." Dalton finally looked at her, and the expression on his face was carefully blank. "Use it to get through the winter. I do not need it." "Dalton, we had an agreement. You earned that money." "I said keep it, Eliza." His voice was rougher now, frayed around the edges. "Just let me go, please." "Why?" The word came out fierce and challenging. "Why are you running away? Is it something I did, something I said? You did not do anything wrong." Dalton picked up his rifle, checking the load with hands that were not quite steady. "I just need to go." "That is not an answer." "It is the only answer I have." Eliza crossed the barn in 3 quick steps and put herself between Dalton and his horse. "I know you well enough now to know when you are lying. Tell me the truth. Why are you leaving?" Dalton closed his eyes, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping under his skin. "Because if I stay, I am going to do something incredibly stupid, like tell you that I am in love with you, and that will just complicate everything and make it harder for both of us when I eventually have to leave anyway." The world seemed to stop. Eliza stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "You love me?" "Yes." The word was torn from him, raw and reluctant. "I love you, and I have no business loving you. I am a drifter, Eliza. I have $50 to my name, a horse, and a rifle. I do not have a home or a future or anything to offer a woman like you. You deserve someone stable, someone who can give you security and a good life. You do not deserve a cowboy who will probably get himself killed doing something stupid before he is 35. What if I do not care about any of that?" Eliza heard herself say, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "What if all I care about is that you are good and kind, and that you make me feel safe in a way I have not felt since my father died? What if I love you too?" Dalton's eyes snapped open. "Eliza, do not what? Do not tell you the truth. It is too late for that. I love you, Dalton Cole. I think I have been falling in love with you since the day you climbed up on my barn roof to fix the shingles, since the night you promised me I would not have to marry Marcus Hennigan. You can leave if that is what you need to do, but do not leave thinking that I do not care. Do not leave thinking that you are not wanted here." They stood facing each other in the dusty barn, the air between them electric with everything unsaid. Then Dalton dropped his rifle and closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, cupping her face in his hands and kissing her with a desperation that stole her breath. Eliza kissed him back, rising on her toes and wrapping her arms around his neck, pouring everything she felt into the kiss, all the fear and hope and love that had been building for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dalton rested his forehead against hers. "I do not have anything to give you," he said hoarsely. "No money, no prospects, nothing that would make me a decent husband." "I do not need money or prospects," Eliza said, holding his face between her hands. "I need you, just you. Is that not enough? It should not be enough. You should want more than a cowboy with nothing but the clothes on his back. Well, I am terrible at wanting what I should want. I have always been stubborn that way." She smiled at him through the tears that were streaming down her face. "Stay, please stay. We will figure out the rest together." Dalton pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, and Eliza felt his whole body shaking. "I want to," he whispered. "God, Eliza, I want to stay so badly, but I cannot ask you to tie yourself to someone like me. You deserve better." "You do not get to decide what I deserve," Eliza said fiercely. "That is my choice, and I choose you. I will always choose you." They stood wrapped in each other's arms as the sun moved across the sky and the shadows lengthened in the barn, and slowly, Eliza felt Dalton's resolve begin to crumble. He held her like she was something precious, something worth protecting, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "If I stay, I want to do this right. I want to court you properly, ask for your hand like a gentleman instead of a drifter who is taking advantage of a woman's loneliness. I want to be someone you can be proud of." "I am already proud of you," Eliza said. "But if you want to court me, then court me. I will not say no to being wooed by a handsome cowboy." Dalton laughed, a sound of pure relief, and kissed her again, slower this time, tender instead of desperate. When they finally separated, he picked up his rifle and carefully unpacked his saddlebags, putting his things back in the corner of the barn where they had lived for the past 6 weeks. Eliza watched with a smile so wide her face hurt, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. "I am going to need to find work," Dalton said as he unsaddled his horse. "I cannot live off your charity, and I will not be a kept man." "There is plenty of work here on the homestead," Eliza pointed out. "The barn still needs more repairs. The windmill is making a noise that suggests something is about to break, and I am sure we can think of 100 other projects that need attention before winter." That is not real work. That is me helping around the place you are letting me live. I need to earn actual wages. Then we will hire you on as a farmhand. I will pay you the going rate, you will do the work, and everyone will be satisfied that everything is proper and above board. Dalton gave her a long look. You are not going to make this easy on me, are you? Not even a little bit, Eliza said cheerfully. I have discovered that I am very good at getting my way when I set my mind to it. You might as well get used to it now. The next few weeks were strange and wonderful. Dalton did hire on officially as a farmhand, taking on all the heavy work around the homestead, while Eliza managed the house and the kitchen garden. But in the evenings after the work was done, he would walk with her around the property, holding her hand and talking about everything and nothing. His childhood in Missouri, her memories of her mother, their dreams for the future. They were learning each other, mapping the contours of personality and preference, and Eliza found herself falling more in love with every passing day. Dalton was, as he had promised, the perfect gentleman. He kissed her good night on the porch each evening, and then retreated to his bedroll in the barn, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. He accompanied her to church on Sunday mornings, enduring the curious stares and whispered speculation of the congregation with quiet dignity. And he made a point of introducing himself to all the men in town who might have opinions about a stranger courting Eliza Bennett. It was old-fashioned and rather endearing, and Eliza loved him all the more for his determination to do everything correctly. Marcus Hennigan, predictably, was not pleased by this turn of events. He confronted Eliza outside the church one Sunday in late October, his face mottled with anger. I heard you have taken up with some cowboy drifter. I hope you realize what a fool you are making of yourself. What I am doing is none of your concern, Mr. Hennigan, Eliza said coolly. The debt to you has been paid in full. You have no claim on me or my property. That man is using you, Marcus hissed, leaning in close enough that Eliza could smell the pomade in his hair. He is after your land and whatever money you have left. Once he has what he wants, he will be gone and you will be left with nothing. The only man who has ever made me feel like property to be claimed is you, Eliza said, her voice low and furious. Dalton has treated me with more respect and kindness in 2 months than you have shown me in 2 years. If you ever speak ill of him again, I will make sure everyone in Newton knows exactly what kind of man you are. She turned and walked away before Marcus could respond, her hands shaking with anger and adrenaline. Dalton was waiting by the wagon, and one look at her face told him something was wrong. What did he say to you? Nothing worth repeating. Take me home, please. They drove back to the homestead in silence, but when they arrived, Dalton took her hand and led her to sit on the porch steps. Tell me what he said. He said you were using me, that you were after my land and my money. Eliza picked at the fabric of her skirt, unable to meet his eyes. He said you would leave once you got what you wanted. Do you believe that? No, of course not. Are you sure? Because if you have even a shred of doubt, I need to know. Eliza finally looked at him, at the worry and vulnerability in his eyes, and felt her anger at Marcus Hennigan transform into something softer. I do not doubt you, she said firmly. Not for a second. Marcus is a small, spiteful man who cannot stand to see me happy with someone else. That is all this is. Dalton pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. I would never hurt you, Eliza. I need you to believe that. I do believe it. I trust you completely. They sat together on the porch as the sun set, and Eliza thought about trust and faith, and the leap of courage it took to give your heart to another person. She had spent so much of her life being careful, being practical, doing what was expected and sensible. Falling in love with Dalton was neither expected nor sensible, but it was the truest thing she had ever done. Winter came to Kansas with a vengeance, bringing freezing temperatures and a snow that blanketed the prairie in white. Dalton moved his sleeping quarters from the barn to the small storage room off the kitchen, a compromise that allowed him to stay warm while still maintaining propriety. They spent the long winter evenings together by the fire, Eliza mending clothes while Dalton read aloud from her small collection of books, his deep voice bringing life to stories of adventure and romance. On Christmas Eve, Dalton surprised her with a gift, a small wooden box he had carved himself, decorated with intricate patterns of wheat and flowers. Inside was a pair of hair combs made from polished horn, simple but beautiful. Eliza gave him a new shirt she had sewn from fabric she had bought on her last trip to town, and gloves lined with fur to keep his hands warm during the cold winter work. They exchanged gifts like an old married couple, comfortable and content in each other's company, and Eliza thought that this was what happiness felt like, this quiet joy, this sense of belonging. January brought bitter cold and a sickness that swept through Newton, taking the very young and the very old. Eliza and Dalton stayed close to the homestead, venturing to town only when necessary for supplies. It was during one of these trips that Dalton saw the notice in the window of the gunsmith shop. Top-quality rifles for sale, used but well-maintained, fair prices. He stood looking at that notice for a long time, his expression thoughtful, while Eliza finished her shopping at the general store. Spring came slowly, the snow melting in patches to reveal the brown grass underneath. Eliza began planning for the spring planting, discussing with Dalton what crops to put in and how to manage the work. They had fallen into an easy partnership, making decisions together, each trusting the other's judgment. It felt like marriage in everything but name, and Eliza caught herself sometimes imagining what it would be like to make it official, to stand before Reverend Collins and pledge her life to Dalton Cole. But as the weeks went by and Dalton said nothing about marriage, Eliza began to worry. He loved her, she was certain of that. He showed her every day in 1,000 small ways, the coffee he brought her each morning, the way he anticipated her needs before she voiced them, the tender way he kissed her goodnight. But he never spoke of the future, never hinted that he was thinking of marriage, and Eliza did not know how to ask without sounding like she was pressuring him. It was mid-April when Dalton told her he needed to ride to Wichita for a few days. "There is a man there who is selling farming equipment cheap," he explained. "A plow that would make the spring work much easier, and some tools we could use around the homestead. I want to go look at what he has, see if any of it is worth buying. How much money would you need?" Eliza asked, mentally calculating what they had left in savings. "I have enough saved from my wages. This is something I want to do, Eliza. Let me provide for us in this small way." She agreed, though she did not like the idea of him being gone for several days. They had not been apart for more than a few hours since he had decided to stay, and the homestead would feel empty without him. Dalton left before dawn on a Friday morning, his saddlebags packed and his rifle in its scabbard. He kissed Eliza goodbye on the porch, holding her close for a long moment. "I will be back by Tuesday at the latest. Bar the doors at night and keep the shotgun loaded. I will be fine. I managed before you came along, remember? Humor me. I worry about you." He rode off as the sun was rising, and Eliza watched until he disappeared over the horizon. Then she went inside and threw herself into work, trying not to think about how quiet the house felt without him. Dalton returned on Monday evening, riding in just as Eliza was finishing the evening chores. She ran to meet him, her heart soaring at the sight of him, and he dismounted and caught her up in his arms, spinning her around. "I missed you," he said, his face buried in her hair. "I missed you too. Did you find the equipment? I found something better. Come walk with me. There is something I want to show you. He took her hand and led her toward the rise where they had first looked out over the homestead together all those months ago. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the spring grass was green and lush under their feet. When they reached the top of the rise, Dalton stopped and turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. I have been thinking a lot about the future, he began, and Eliza felt her heart start to pound. About what I want my life to look like, where I want to be. And the truth is, I want to be here, with you, for as long as you will have me. Dalton, let me finish, please. He took a deep breath. When I came to your camp that morning back in August, I was running from everything, my past, my grief, the possibility of putting down roots anywhere. I had convinced myself that I was better off alone, that caring about people only led to pain and loss. But you changed that. You made me want to stay, to build something, to be part of something bigger than just myself. You made me want to be a better man. Tears were streaming down Eliza's face now, but she did not interrupt. Dalton reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. I do not have much to offer you. I am still just a cowboy with not much more than $50 to my name. But I went to Wichita to find the one thing I needed to ask you properly. He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a simple gold band, gleaming in the sunset light. I traded my rifle for this ring. It was the only thing I owned that was valuable enough to get something worthy of you. Eliza stared at the ring, her throat too tight to speak. Dalton's rifle was his most prized possession, the one thing he had carried with him for years, the tool of his trade and his livelihood. To trade it for a ring was to give up part of his identity, part of his past, and she understood in that moment exactly what he was offering her, everything he had, everything he was. Eliza Bennett, Dalton said, dropping to one knee in the spring grass, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you? Will you take this ring and my heart and whatever poor future I can give you, and make me the happiest man in Kansas? Yes, Eliza sobbed, pulling him to his feet and throwing her arms around his neck. Yes, of course I will marry you. I do not care about money or prospects or anything except you. I love you so much, Dalton. He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, the gold warm against her skin. Then he kissed her as the sun set behind them, and Eliza thought that this was what she had been waiting for all her life. This man, this moment, this perfect expression of love. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the Newton church, with half the town in attendance. Eliza wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her, and Dalton wore a new suit he had bought specially for the occasion, looking handsome and slightly uncomfortable in the formal clothes. Reverend Collins performed the ceremony, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Dalton kissed Eliza with such tenderness that several of the women in the congregation sighed audibly. The reception was held at the homestead, with tables set up in the yard and food contributed by all the neighbors who had come to celebrate. There was music and dancing, and Eliza waltzed with her new husband under the spring stars, feeling like the luckiest woman alive. Even Marcus Hennigan made an appearance, though he left early after making a stiff speech about wishing them well that fooled no one. That night, Eliza and Dalton began their married life together in the small farmhouse that was now truly theirs. Dalton carried her over the threshold with great ceremony, making Eliza laugh, and they spent their first night as husband and wife talking and planning and dreaming about the future they would build together. The first year of their marriage was hard work, but filled with joy. They planted crops in the spring, tended them through the summer, and brought in a harvest in the fall that was even better than the year before. With the profit, They were able to make improvements to the homestead. A new roof for the barn, a better pump for the well, glass windows for the house to replace the oiled paper that had covered the openings. Slowly, the homestead transformed from a struggling farm into a thriving one, and Eliza knew it was because of Dalton's tireless work and his determination to provide for them both. In the second year, Eliza discovered she was pregnant. She told Dalton one morning in late spring, watching his face carefully for his reaction. He had gone very still, his coffee cup halfway to his lips, and for a moment she worried that he was not happy about the news. Then he set down the cup very carefully, crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides, and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around while laughing like a man who had just won a fortune. "We are having a baby," he kept saying, over and over, like he could not quite believe it. "Eliza, we are having a baby." Their son was born in January during a snowstorm that trapped them in the house for 3 days. The midwife from town could not make it out to the homestead, so Dalton delivered the baby himself, his hands steady despite his fear, his voice calm and reassuring as he coached Eliza through the labor. When the baby finally arrived, red-faced and squalling, Dalton cut the cord with shaking hands and laid the infant on Eliza's chest, tears streaming down his face. "What should we name him?" Eliza asked, exhausted but elated, cradling the baby against her. "James," Dalton said without hesitation. "After my father, if that is all right with you. James Cole, I like it." She looked up at her husband, at the awe and love on his face as he looked at their son, and felt her heart expand with joy. "He has your eyes." "Poor kid," Dalton said, but he was smiling. He sat on the edge of the bed and wrapped his arms around them both, his wife and his son, and Eliza had never seen him look so peaceful. "I am going to be a good father to him, Eliza. I promise you that. I am going to give him everything I never had. Stability, security, a home where he knows he is loved." "I know you will," Eliza said, leaning into him. "You are already the best man I know." They raised James in the farmhouse where Eliza had grown up, teaching him to love the land and to value hard work and honest dealing. Dalton proved to be a patient, devoted father, carrying the boy on his shoulders as he did the farm work, teaching him to ride almost as soon as he could walk, reading to him every night before bed from the growing collection of books they acquired over the years. When James was 3, Eliza became pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to a daughter they named Caroline, after Dalton's sister. Dalton wept when Eliza told him the name she had chosen, and he held baby Caroline like she was made of spun glass, murmuring promises to her that he would keep her safe, that he would never let anything hurt her. The years passed in the way that happy years do, flowing like water, each season bringing its own rhythms and routines. The homestead continued to prosper under Dalton's management, and he gained a reputation in Newton as a fair dealer and a skilled farmer. Men who had once looked at him with suspicion now sought his advice on crops and livestock, and Eliza watched with pride as her husband earned the respect of the community that had once seen him as just a drifter with nothing to offer. They added 2 more children to their family, another son named William, and a second daughter they called Margaret. The farmhouse that had once felt so empty was now filled with noise and laughter, with the sound of children playing and the organized chaos of a large family. Eliza often thought back to that desperate morning when she had ridden out to the cattle camp, not knowing if she would find help or just another closed door. She thought about how close she had come to giving up, to marrying Marcus Hennigan out of sheer desperation, and she thanked God every day that Dalton Cole had been the man she found that morning. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Dalton took Eliza back to the rise where he had proposed, leaving the children with a neighbor for the evening. They sat in the grass as the sun set, just as they had a decade before, and Dalton took her hand, his thumb rubbing over the gold band that had never left her finger. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Marrying me instead of someone more established, someone who could have given you an easier life." Eliza turned to look at him, at the face she knew better than her own, at the gray that was starting to show at his temples and the lines around his eyes that came from years of squinting into the sun. "Not for a single moment," she said. "You gave me everything I ever wanted, Dalton. A home, a family, a partnership built on love and respect. What more could I possibly ask for?" "I never did buy another rifle," he said with a slight smile. "Still using that old Winchester I bought with some of our harvest money that second year. Sometimes I think about that rifle I traded, wonder where it ended up." "That rifle bought us this life," Eliza said, squeezing his hand. "It was the best trade you ever made." "Second best," Dalton corrected, pulling her close. "The best trade I ever made was agreeing to stay on your homestead for 6 weeks instead of riding on to Dodge City. I traded my freedom for a chance at something more, and I got everything." They watched the sunset together, this couple who had built a life from nothing but determination and love. And when the first stars appeared, Dalton led Eliza back down to the farmhouse where their children were waiting. The lights were on in the windows, warm and welcoming, and smoke was rising from the chimney. It looked like home, Eliza thought. It looked like everything she had ever dreamed of during those dark days after her father died, when the future had seemed like nothing but a series of impossible choices. The children grew up strong and healthy, each of them inheriting their father's work ethic and their mother's stubborn determination. James took to farming like he was born to it, working beside his father in the fields and learning everything Dalton could teach him about managing the land. Caroline was clever and bookish, with a sharp mind for figures that Eliza nurtured by teaching her to manage the household accounts. William was the adventurous one, always getting into scrapes and coming home with torn clothes and wild stories, and Margaret was the gentle soul, content to help her mother in the kitchen and the garden. As the children grew, Dalton and Eliza found themselves with more time together, returning to the easy companionship of their early years. They would sit on the porch in the evenings after the work was done, watching the sun set over the wheat fields and talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes Dalton would play his harmonica, a skill he had taught himself over the years, and Eliza would sing along, her voice sweet and true in the Kansas twilight. When James turned 18, he announced his intention to stay on the homestead and work the land alongside his father. Dalton clasped his son's shoulder with obvious pride, and they began making plans to expand the operation, buying additional acreage from a neighboring farmer who was retiring. Caroline went to Teachers College in Wichita, determined to bring education to the rural communities that so often went without, and she returned to Newton 3 years later to take a position at the local school. William, true to his adventurous nature, joined up with a cattle drive heading to Montana, promising to return in a few years once he had seen more of the world. Margaret married a young doctor who had recently opened a practice in Newton, and they built a house in town, close enough that Eliza could visit her grandchildren whenever she wanted. The years continued to roll by, bringing changes both large and small. Newton grew from a rough cattle town into a proper community, with paved streets and a railroad depot and electric lights that replaced the old oil lamps. The homestead grew too, expanding to nearly 200 acres, one of the most successful operations in the region. Dalton hired on help during the busy seasons, young men who reminded him of himself at that age, hungry for work, looking for a chance to prove themselves. On a summer morning when they had been married for 25 years, Eliza woke to find Dalton already up, standing at the bedroom window and looking out at the fields that stretched golden in the early light. She joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her cheek against his back. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "About how lucky I am," Dalton said, covering her hands with his. "About how different my life would be if I had just ridden past your homestead that morning instead of stopping to help. I would probably be dead in a ditch somewhere, or working some dead-end job for wages that barely covered whiskey and cards. Instead, I have this. You, our children, this land. I have a legacy, Eliza. I have something that will outlast me. That is more than I ever dared to dream of when I was younger." "You earned every bit of it," Eliza said fiercely. "You took a chance on a desperate woman and a failing farm, and you worked yourself to the bone to make something of it. You should be proud of what we have built together. I am proud, but I am also grateful. Grateful to you for seeing something in me worth keeping, for loving me when I had nothing to offer but a willingness to work hard. You saved my life as much as I saved yours that year, Eliza. I need you to know that." They stood together at the window as the sun climbed higher, and Eliza thought about the journey they had taken together, from desperate strangers to lovers to partners to this comfortable, deep love that had only grown stronger with time. They had weathered hardships and celebrated triumphs, raised children and buried dreams, and through it all, they had held fast to each other. That evening, their children and grandchildren came to the homestead for dinner, a weekly tradition that Eliza treasured. The big dining table that Dalton had built years ago was crowded with people and noise. 3 generations of Coles gathered together. Eliza looked around the table at these people she loved. James and his wife and their 3 children, Caroline with her husband the schoolteacher and their twin daughters, Margaret and her doctor husband with baby number 2 on the way, and William, who had returned from Montana the year before with a wife and a newborn son of his own. At the head of the table sat Dalton, older now but still strong, still the steady presence that held their family together. After dinner, while the women cleaned up and the children played in the yard, Dalton and his sons walked the property, discussing plans for the fall planting and repairs that needed to be made before winter. Eliza watched them from the kitchen window, 3 generations of Cole men walking the land that Dalton had fought so hard to keep, and she felt a profound sense of satisfaction. This was what they had built, not just a successful farm but a family legacy, a place where their children and grandchildren could put down roots and thrive. As the years went on, Dalton began to slow down, letting James take over more of the daily operation of the farm. He and Eliza spent more time together, taking long walks around the property, visiting with their growing number of grandchildren, and simply enjoying the quiet contentment of a long marriage well lived. They celebrated their 30th anniversary with a party that brought together what seemed like half the county, friends and neighbors gathering to honor a couple who had become something of a legend in Newton. The desperate widow and the cowboy who had traded everything he owned for a chance at love. On a spring morning much like the one when they had first met, Eliza and Dalton rode out to the rise above their homestead, moving slower now but still together. They dismounted and sat in the grass, looking out over the land that had been the center of their world for more than 3 decades. "If you could do it all again," Eliza asked, "would you change anything?" Dalton was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "I would have kissed you sooner," he said finally. "I wasted too much time being noble and proper when I could have been holding you. Other than that, no, I would not change a single thing. Not even the hardships, the years when money was tight and we did not know if we would make it through the winter, especially not those years. They taught us what we were made of, what we could endure together. Without the hard times, we would not appreciate the good times nearly as much. He took her hand, his thumb tracing over the gold band that had long since molded itself to her finger. I traded my rifle for this ring, and it was the best decision I ever made. Everything good in my life came from that choice. You, our children, this land, this life. I regret nothing. Eliza leaned against his shoulder, and they sat together as the sun climbed higher, warming the earth and coaxing new life from the soil. Behind them, the farmhouse stood solid and welcoming, smoke rising from the chimney, curtains fluttering in the windows. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear their grandchildren playing, their laughter carried on the spring breeze. "Thank you," Eliza said softly. "For what?" "For stopping that morning, for staying, for loving me even when it was inconvenient and impractical, for giving me a life I never dared to hope for. Thank you for being brave enough to ask for help. Thank you for giving a drifter cowboy with no prospects and no money a chance to be something more. Thank you for loving me." Dalton kissed the top of her head, and Eliza closed her eyes, memorizing this moment. The warmth of the sun, the feel of Dalton's arms around her, the knowledge that they had built something lasting and true. They sat on the rise for a long time that morning. Two people who had found each other against all odds and created a love story that would be told in their family for generations. When they finally stood to head back to the farmhouse, Dalton helped Eliza onto her horse with the same gentle care he had shown her from the very beginning, and they rode home together, side by side, just as they had lived their whole lives. In the years that followed, as they grew older and their family continued to expand, Eliza and Dalton never forgot the lesson they had learned in those desperate days when their love was new. That the most valuable things in life cannot be bought or sold, that love is worth any sacrifice, and that sometimes the best trades are the ones that make no practical sense, but change everything in the ways that matter most. The homestead continued to prosper under James's management, and eventually, his oldest son took over, ensuring that the land would remain in the Cole family for generations to come. Each new generation heard the story of how it all began. The cowboy who had nothing but a rifle and a willingness to work, the woman who needed help more than she needed pride, and the sunrise proposal that sealed their fate. Dalton and Eliza lived to see their great-grandchildren born, to witness the turn of the century and the beginning of a new era. They watched as Newton transformed from a rough frontier town into a modern community, as automobiles replaced horses on the streets and electric lights replaced kerosene lamps in the homes. But through all the changes, their love remained constant, a steady flame that had been kindled on a desperate August morning and had burned bright for more than 50 years. On a warm June evening, when they were both well into their 70s, Dalton and Eliza sat on the porch as they had done thousands of times before, watching the sun set over the wheat fields. The air was sweet with the smell of growing things, and the sound of their great-grandchildren playing in the yard drifted on the breeze. "I have been thinking," Dalton said, his hand finding Eliza's as naturally as breathing, "about what I would want people to remember about our life together. About what was important." "And what conclusion did you reach?" Eliza asked, squeezing his hand gently. "That love is always worth the risk. That giving up everything you think you need for the one thing you actually need is never a mistake. That trading a rifle for a ring and proposing at sunrise was the smartest thing I ever did, even if it looked like foolishness at the time." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were bright with emotion. I want people to know that real love is not about what you have or what you can provide. It is about showing up, doing the work, and choosing each other every single day, even when it is hard. Especially when it is hard, Eliza agreed. That is when it matters most. They sat together as the stars came out, an old couple who had weathered everything life threw at them and come through stronger for it. And when they finally went inside to join their family for dinner, they walked hand in hand, their gold wedding bands glinting in the porch light, symbols of the promise they had made to each other all those years ago and had kept faithfully ever since. The story of Dalton and Eliza Cole became part of the fabric of Newton, Kansas, a tale told to young couples to give them hope and to old couples to remind them of their own beginning. It was a story about sacrifice and faith, about the courage it takes to love someone when you have nothing to offer but yourself, and about the miracles that can happen when two people decide that together is better than apart, no matter what the cost. And every spring, when the wheat turned golden in the fields surrounding the old Cole homestead, people would remember the cowboy who had no ring and no money, who traded his rifle for a gold band and proposed at sunrise to the woman he loved. They would remember, and they would believe, just a little bit more in the transformative power of love. Years later, when both Dalton and Eliza had passed peacefully in their sleep within days of each other, their children found a letter Dalton had written and left in his desk. It was addressed to their descendants, to all the generations of Coles who would come after. And in it, he had written the story of that first morning when he had decided to stay, the 6 weeks of harvest work, and the moment when he realized that he loved Eliza Bennett more than he loved his own freedom. The letter ended with these words: "I traded my rifle, the symbol of my old life, for a gold band and a chance at something better. Some might say I gave up my livelihood, my security, my very identity. But I gained so much more: a partner, a family, a purpose, and a love that sustained me for more than 50 years. If any of you ever face a choice between what is practical and what is true, between what makes sense and what your heart demands, I hope you will remember my story. I hope you will be brave enough to trade your rifle for a ring, to bet everything on love, and to propose your future at sunrise. That is how legacies are built. That is how lives are changed. That is how miracles happen." The letter was framed and hung in the farmhouse, where it remained for generations, a reminder that the best things in life often require the biggest leaps of faith, and that love is always, always worth whatever it costs. The Cole homestead stands to this day, passed down through 6 generations, a testament to the love of a cowboy and a desperate young widow who found each other at exactly the right moment and built something that would outlast them both. And on clear spring mornings, when the light is just right and the wheat is golden in the fields, some say you can still see 2 figures on the rise above the homestead. A man and a woman, standing hand in hand, watching the sunrise together just as they did on the morning he proposed, just as they did for the rest of their long and happy lives. Their love story became the foundation upon which generations built their own dreams, proving that sometimes the most impractical decisions lead to the most beautiful outcomes, and that a cowboy with nothing but determination and a willingness to sacrifice everything for love can create a legacy that lasts forever. The gold band that Dalton traded his rifle for was eventually passed down to their grandson, who gave it to his own beloved on a sunrise morning much like the one his grandfather had chosen, continuing the tradition of love and sacrifice that had begun more than a century before. And so the story goes on, retold and relived, a reminder that love is not about what you have but about what you are willing to give, and that the most valuable things in life cannot be measured in money or possessions, but only in the moments we share and the promises we keep. Dalton Cole traded his rifle for a gold band and proposed at sunrise. And in doing so, he proved that sometimes the poorest man can be the richest, and that love, when it is true and deep and built on sacrifice, can create miracles that last for generations.